By the final months of the Pacific War, American Marines faced a problem no amount of fireball could solve. Japanese bunker systems did not collapse under bombardment. They absorbed it, they waited, and when the Marines moved forward, they killed them. Artillery failed, naval guns failed. Even flamethrowers worked only at the cost of men who rarely survived long enough to fire. So the Marines did something that was never supposed to happen. They took a weapon designed to kill tanks and turned it into a tool meant to make human beings abandon fortified positions they had sworn to defend to the death. What they fired wasn't meant to penetrate concrete. It was meant to consume oxygen, burn flesh on contact, and turn enclosed spaces into places no one could remain alive inside. The Japanese didn't describe it in technical terms. They didn't call it a rocket or a chemical agent or an incendiary round. They gave it a name. This weapon burned hotter than most battlefield explosives. It rented after being submerged in water, and once it entered a bunker or cave, it didn't need to kill everyone inside. It only needed to make staying impossible. What most people don't know is this: white phosphorus bazooka rounds were never part of a grand strategy. They were born out of failure, out of casualty numbers that commanders could no longer justify, and they worked not because they destroyed fortifications, but because they broke something far more important: discipline, doctrine, the willingness to stay in place and die. From the volcanic bunkers of Iwo Jima to the cave systems of Okinawa, this single modification changed how island warfare was fought, quietly, efficiently, and with consequences that made even its users uncomfortable. Combat reports were classified. Veterans avoid discussing it, not because it didn't work, but because of what it revealed about how wars are actually won. This is the story of the weapon designed not to destroy positions, but to make them uninhabitable, and why the men who used it rarely spoke about it again. By early 1945, the Pacific War had reached a point where brute force no longer produced results. American commanders had learned this lesson the hard way. Island after island followed the same pattern. Weeks of bombardment, thousands of shells, direct hits confirmed by aerial reconnaissance. What the Marines found waiting for them was never the shattered battlefield. The reports promised it was silence. And silence, in the Pacific, almost always meant death. Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved far beyond simple fortifications. On islands like Iwo Jima, the enemy no longer defended the shoreline. They were nodes in a buried network, connected by tunnels, protected by reverse slopes, concealed firing ports, and exits designed to remain invisible until the moment they were used. When naval shells struck, they hit decoys. When artillery collapsed visible structures, the real defenses remained rock. And when they did, the island came alive. Machine guns erupted from openings no one had seen minutes earlier. Mortars fell from positions that vanished before counterfire could be adjusted. A single bunker could stop an entire company, not by killing everyone, but by killing just enough men to halt forward movement. In reality, it was poorly matched to the environment. Artillery was imprecise against point targets hidden underground. Naval guns were devastating, but blind, even direct hits often failed to neutralize positions built specifically. A bazooka, effective in Europe, struggled here. Its shaped charges were designed to penetrate armor, not 5-foot thick concrete reinforced with steel rails and volcanic stone. Rockets struck, exploded, and often accomplished nothing beyond alerting the defenders. Flamethrowers worked when they could be brought forward. But to use one, a Marine had to cross open ground under direct fire, carrying a heavy fuel tank that made him a priority target. Most flamethrower operators did not survive long. Their losses were immediate and irreplaceable. Satchel charges required even closer casualties. By March, casualty reports from Iwo Jima were no longer projections. They were numbers that could not be ignored. Tens of thousands of Japanese defenders remained entrenched. American losses climbed daily, and the island was not even fully secured. What made the situation worse was the nature of the enemy. They were not conserving forces for a counterattack. They were prepared to die in place. Doctrine emphasized endurance. Discipline emphasized immobility. Positions were held until death and slot retreat. That doctrine may destroy structures, where they could not compel surrender. Firepower could kill, but it could not force men who had accepted death to abandon their posts. This was the core problem facing American commanders. Not how to destroy the bunkers, but how to remove the men inside them. What they needed was not a more powerful explosion. They needed a weapon that changed the conditions of survival inside fortified positions. Something that made staying physically impossible. Something that turned the interior of a bunker from protection into a liability. The solution did not come from a new weapon system or a revolutionary invention. It came from a quiet realization made by engineers and officers who had watched too many assaults fail. The bazooka already had the range. It already reached targets. Infantry could not. What if the problem wasn't penetration? What if the problem was oxygen? That question would lead to a modification never intended when the bazooka was designed. A decision driven not by Straggrass, but by Iris's meters. Gained. And once that decision was made, the character of bunker warfare in the Pacific would change permanently. Not loudly, not publicly, but decisively. The solution did not arrive with an announcement. There was no new designation circulated across divisions, no doctrine rewritten, no training manual updated in advance. What existed quietly was a capability that had been sitting on the edge of acceptability for years. White phosphorus was not new to warfare. It had been used for smoke, for illumination, for marking targets. Its behavior was well understood by chemists and deeply feared by anyone who had seen it burn. It burned at temperatures that ordinary materials could not survive, and it continued burning until either the oxygen was gone or the material itself was consumed. Water did not stop it, it only delayed it. For decades, white phosphorus had been treated as a supporting tool, not a primary weapon, something to obscure vision. No one had designed it to be fired directly into confined spaces occupied by men. But the Pacific War created a different set of questions. Engineers within the Chemical Warfare Service had been experimenting since 1943 with ways to deliver phosphorus more precisely. Artillery shells scattered it too broadly. It was delivery. The bazooka, originally built to hunt tanks, offered an unexpected answer. Accurate at distance. Already in widespread use, and most importantly, it could place a payload exactly where infantry fire could not, directly into bunker opening stentile shafts. And cave mouths, the shaped charge cone, the component responsible for armor penetration, was removed. In its place, engineers installed a thin metal casing designed to rupture on impact rather than pierce. Inside sat just over a pound of white phosphorus sealed against moisture, surrounded by a bursting charge calibrated not to kill instantly, but to disperse. Hundreds of small pieces would scatter outward, and with them burning phosphorus particles. The intent was not collapse. It was saturation. Every opening became a liability. Every enclosed space, a trap half the challenge. White phosphorus reacted violently with moisture, and the Pacific was nothing but moisture. Humidity, salt air, catastrophe. Rounds ignited prematurely, seals degraded. Handling accidents occurred during testing. The solution required hermetic sealing, waterproof containers, and strict storage procedures. A round had to be isolated from humidity with desiccants and inspected before use. Warning accompanied the ammunition. The danger was not theoretical. A phosphorus fragment buried in soil could remain dormant until disturbed. Then it would ignite. When the first production rounds arrived in the Pacific in early 1945, they were issued selectively. Unpredictable, and nobody wanted stories spreading before results were confirmed. The men who handled the rounds understood immediately that this was not standard ammunition. The markings were wrong. The storage containers were different. Armorers treated the rockets with visible caution. Rumors followed. This was something the brass thought might work. What no one could explain, because it hadn't been tested in full combat conditions, was how defenders would react. White phosphorus was lethal, yes, but lethality alone did not guarantee effectiveness against men trained to die in place. What made the round truly different was not its ability to kill. It was its ability to change the environment. Inside a bunker, burning phosphorus did three things at once. It produced intense heat, it generated dense white smoke, and it consumed oxygen rapidly. Within seconds, visibility dropped to zero. Breathing became painful, then impossible. A defender did not need to be struck directly to be affected. This was not destruction in the conventional sense. The bunker might remain standing, the structure intact, but the space inside became uninhabitable. For Japanese defenders conditioned to endure bombardment and accept death, this presented a problem they had not trained. For endurance meant nothing without air. Doctrine offered no solution for fire that could not be smothered. Water made it worse. Retreat meant exposure. The first time the weapon was fired at operation, it was a test, born of desperation. A single rocket, a single bunker, and within seconds a defensive position that had resisted weeks of assault went silent, not destroyed, abandoned. What followed would force commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had not found a way to break bunkers. The first combat use of the white phosphorus bazooka round did not happen during a major offensive. There was no coordinated assault, no battalion-level plan built around it. It happened because a sector had stalled for days, and men were dying for inches of ground. The bunker in question sat on a low rise of volcanic rock, overlooking an approach route the Marines needed to clear. Every attempt to move forward ended the same way. Machine gun fire erupted, men went down, and the survivors crawled back into cover. Artillery had already hit it. Naval gunfire had already hit it. The Marines studying it had learned to recognize the signs. The firing port was narrow. The concrete face showed blast scarring, but no structural damage. There were likely secondary exits, hidden, well, camouflaged, positioned to allow escape or repositioning. It was the kind of position to neutralize it. One Marine carried a standard bazooka, another carried a single white phosphorus round. There was no ceremony in the exchange. The rocket was handed over quietly. The instructions were brief: aim low, avoid direct line of sight after impact. Suppressing fire began first. A Browning, automatic rifle, opened up, hammering the bunker's firing port. It was distraction. 10 seconds, maybe less. That was all the time the bazooka operator had. He rose just enough to bring the launcher onto his shoulder. The sight picture was crude, a dark rectangle in a gray concrete face. He fired. The rocket left the tube with the same sound as any other round. There was nothing unusual about the flight. When it struck, the initial effect seemed underwhelming. The explosion was smaller than expected. There was no dramatic collapse, no shower of debris. For a moment it appeared to have failed. Then the color changed. White particles erupted outward from the impact point, scattering across the bunker's face like sparks thrown sideways. They did not fall. They clung. Smoke began pouring from openings the Marines hadn't known existed. At first it was thin, then dense, then continuous. The machine gun stopped firing. Seconds passed. No return fire. Then the sound reached them. It was several, overlapping, panicked, uncontrolled. Coughing, scrambling, the smoke thickened, pouring from ventilation shafts and cracks in the concrete. The Marines watched, unsure what they were seeing. It had cleared bunkers before they knew the sounds of resistance. They knew the silence that followed death. The bunker's rear exit, previously invisible, suddenly became obvious. 3 Japanese soldiers burst into the open. They were not charging, they were fleeing. Their uniforms were burning, not in large flames, but in dozens of small points. White fragments glowed against dark fabric, each producing its own trail of smoke. One man tried to beat the fire out with his hands, another dove into the volcanic ash, rolling desperately. It did nothing. The Marines did not hesitate. Rifle fire cut them down before they could reach cover. The smoke continued to pour from the bunker. Minutes passed. No one else emerged. When the Marines finally approached, they did so cautiously. The ground near the bunker was still hot, fragments embedded in the concrete. Inside, the space was unrecognizable. The structure remained intact, the walls still stood, but the air was unbreathable. Equipment lay abandoned. A machine gun sat where it had been dropped. The floor was scattered with burned fragments and soot. 2 bodies were found inside. Neither showed massive trauma. They had been overcome by smoke and heat before they could escape. The bunker had not been destroyed. It had been rendered unusable. Word spread quickly but quietly. Within hours, other units requested the same ammunition. Within days, commanders began assigning white phosphorus rounds to specific targets, bunkers that resisted conventional assault. The pattern repeated. A single round, a brief delay, smoke. Positions that had held under bombardment were abandoned after seconds of exposure. Not every use was clean, not every round functioned perfectly, but the effect was undeniable. The weapon did not defeat the enemy by force. It defeated him by removing the conditions required to fight. For the first time in weeks, progress resumed. Casualty rates dropped, not because the fighting became less brutal, but because fewer Marines were forced to close the distance. What unsettled many of the men who witnessed it was not the violence. It was how quickly discipline collapsed. These were defenders trained to die in place, men who had endured hunger, bombardment, and isolation. And yet, faced with white phosphorus, they ran. The lesson was impossible to ignore. Some weapons kill. Others make survival incompatible with resistance. And once its effect was understood, the war underground began to change. The effect of the white phosphorus bazooka round was not debated for long. In war, theories collapse quickly, numbers do not. Within days of its first combat use, reports began to show a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Units equipped with the new rounds advanced farther, with fewer losses. Positions that had stalled assaults for weeks were neutralized in minutes. Commanders noticed the change immediately, not because the fighting became easier, but because it became shorter. Before bunker reduction followed a predictable rhythm. Suppression, advance, casualties. A single rocket often replaced multiple assaults. Where flamethrower teams once lost men closing to 30 yards, bazooka operators fired from cover. The distance alone saved lives. After action reports began to quantify what the men on the ground already felt. Bunker assaults, using white phosphorus rounds, showed significant methods. The reduction was not marginal, it was decisive. It forced commanders to confront an uncomfortable reality. The weapon was effective not because it caused greater destruction, but because it altered defender behavior. It shortened engagements by eliminating interference as a vital tactic for Japanese forces. The white phosphorus round did not give defenders time to adapt. There was no gradual escalation, no warning phase. Once fired, the environment inside a position changed instantly. Visibility vanished, air disappeared, heat intensified, survived an immediate movement. Japanese defense. White smoke that filled tunnels, fire that burned through clothing and skin, pain that water made worse. Most telling was not how many men were killed, but how many positions were abandoned intact. The enemy did not counterattack those positions later. They did not attempt to reoccupy them. Once a bunker had been hit with white phosphorus, it was considered cursed. The psychological impact spread faster than the physical one. Defenders warned each other. Rumors circulated through tunnel networks. Positions that had held firm against artillery now emptied after a single strike. Attempts at countermeasures failed. Mothers stored water inside positions. Water suppressed the fire briefly, then rained it when exposed to air. The result was often worse. The more water used, the more phosphorus fragments were spread across the interior of the bunker. Commanders on the American side took note, but not all were comfortable with what they saw. White phosphorus had always occupied a gray space. It was not classified as a chemical weapon under existing protocols, but its effects blurred boundaries that many officers preferred to keep clear. There were concerns about perception, and yet the casualty figures spoke louder than caution. Requests for the new rounds increased. Supply officer reduction. Distribution remained control, not because of scarcity alone, but because of intent. This was not ammunition to be used casually. Each round was assigned to a specific target. Each use required just like standard ordnance and more like a specialized tool. Commanders understood its limitations. White phosphorus rounds were sensitive to moisture. Improperly stored ammunition could fail or ignite prematurely. Operators required discipline and inspection routine, but those risks were weighed against the certainty of continued losses without it. By the time fighting shifted from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, the pattern was established: cave systems repel. And once again, white phosphorus proved effective where other methods failed. Cave mouths that resisted demolition charges and napalm were cleared in minutes. Defenders evacuated positions that had survived days of bombardment. The weapon did not win battles on its own, but it changed the cost of winning them for American commanders. Progress no longer required sacrificing men at the same rate. Monam returned for Japanese defenders. The battlefield became unpredictable. Positions that had once guaranteed survivance later was not the memory of the fire itself. It was how quickly resistance collapsed once the conditions of survival were removed. War doctrine often assumes men will endure until death if properly conditioned. White phosphorus exposed the limits of that assumption. Breathing is not optional. Heat cannot be ignored and discipline cannot function without air. The weapon did not just force tactical adaptation, it forced a re-evaluation of how fortified warfare actually worked. And with that realization came a decision noon that would shape how the weapon was remembered, or rather how it would not be remembered at all. By the time the fighting shifted toward Okinawa, the weapon was no longer an experiment. It was a known quantity, not openly discussed, not formally celebrated, but quietly integrated into planning wherever fortified positions dominated the terrain. Okinawa presented the same problem, magnified. Instead of isolated bunkers, the island was riddles. Were hollowed out, defensive positions extended deep underground, protected by narrow entrances that funneled attackers. Demolition charges collapsed entrances without neutralizing defenders deeper inside. Napalm burned surface openings while leaving interior chambers intact. Flamethrowers remained effective, but only at distances that continued to cost lives. White phosphorus altered the geometry of the fight. A cave no longer needed to be entered. It only needed to be contaminated. They aimed not at the center of openings, but at the junctions, where walls met ceilings, where fragments would bounce inward instead of embedding. They fired single rounds, waited and observed. Often, that was enough. Reports from Okinawa documented cases where entire cave systems were cleared with 2 or 3 rockets. Defenders either fled into open ground or retreated deeper. Where smoke and oxygen depletion finished the job, the pattern was consistent. Resistance collapsed fastest in positions believed to be secure. The psychologian backed in slowly. Some attempted to seal cave mouths. Others stockpiled water, convinced it would neutralize the burning particles. It did not. In enclosed spaces, water only spread contamination. Burning fragments reignited as soon as they were exposed to air. Misinterpretation of the weapon's effects worsened casualties. The belief that white phosphorus was primarily a smoke agent delayed meaningful countermeasures by the time the reality was understood. On the American side, the weapon's limitations became clearer with scale. White phosphorus rounds were sensitive to storage conditions. Humidity degraded seals, rough handling during amphibious landings, damaged casings. Misfires occurred. Bazooka operators suffered burrs in spulgers. By late spring of 1945, white phosphorus rounds were allocated deliberately, not issued universally, but assigned where resistance was expected to be heaviest. Commanders treated them as force multipliers, 2 rounds per team, sometimes 4, enough to open a path, not enough to invite careless use. This controlled expansion reflected an unspoken understanding. The weapon solved a specific problem. It was not meant to redefine warfare wholesale, yet its success reshaped expectations. Operations that once required prolonged suppression and costly assaults were reduced to brief engagements. Casualty rates continued to drop in units equipped with the rounds. The change was measurable. and it fed directly into planning. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan's home islands, loomed over every decision. Planners anticipated defenses far denser than anything encountered on Okinawa. Millions of civilians, thousands of fortified positions. In that context, white phosphorus was no longer a curiosity. It was a solution commanders wanted available, production compared to scale output. Stockpiles grew. The weapon was integrated into invasion doctrine, not as a headline capability, but as a quiet necessity. Then the war ended. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, surrender. In an instant, the need for mass deployment vanished. Production halted, plans were scrapped, and the weapon. But because its success raised questions no one was eager to answer. White phosphorus occupied an uncomfortable space in post-war memory. It was not classified as a chemical weapon, but it was not easily defended as purely conventional either. Its effects were undeniable. As war crimes trials unfolded and new international norms took shape, attention shifted away from weapons that blurred established categories. Records were classified, reports buried, veteran discouraged. Formally and informally, future munitions borrowed its principles while distancing themselves from its name. But for the men who used it, the memory remained intact. They remembered how quickly resistance collapsed, how silence followed smoke, how positions that had killed Marines for weeks were abandoned in seconds. They also remembered the cost, not in enemy bodies, but in the realization that some weapons win by making survival impossible. And that realization, more than the fire itself, is what followed white phosphorus into the post-war world. When the war ended, the weapon did not disappear immediately. It was still there, stored in depots, listed in inventories, documented in after-action reports. What changed was how it was spoken about, or rather, how it was not. White phosphorus had always existed in a legal gray zone. It was not banned outright. It was not clearly protected either. During the war, that ambiguity mattered less than results. Lives were being lost, positions had to be taken. After the war, the calculus reversed. As tribunals convened in Tokyo and Nuremberg, military lawyers began examining not just what had been done, but how it might be perceived. White phosphorus, though technically classified as an incendiary, carried associations that commanders preferred not to invite scrutiny over. Its effects were difficult to explain without discomfort. It burned without flame. It radiated after water contact. It consumed oxygen in enclosed spaces. None of that fit neatly into the Sony language of post-war narratives. The solution was administrative. In late 1945, documentation related to the development, deployment, and combat use of white phosphorus bazooka rounds was reclassified, not because the technology was revolutionary. Technical manuals were removed from circulation. Combat reports wrestling the rounds were buried among thousands of pages of unremarkable logistic paperwork. Official histories of the Pacific War mentioned bunker reduction. In vague terms, they described hard fighting. Men who had carried the rounds were informed, sometimes explicitly, sometimes by implication, that discussion was discouraged. The reasons were never fully articulated. They didn't need to be. Many veterans were already reluctant to talk. The weapon had worked, that was undeniable. But it had done so in a way that unsettled even those who relied on it. It did not kill in the conventional sense. It transformed spaces into places where survival itself became impossible. For men who had spent months fighting an enemy trained to die in place, the experience left a mark. They remembered defenders replacing discipline. They remembered positions abandoned without further resistance. Those memories did not fit the heroic narratives many preferred to share, and so silence became mutual. As years passed, the weapon faded from institutional memory. Training manuals evolved. New munitions replaced old ones. Lessons were absorbed with air, deny shelter, force movement, but the origin was quietly forgotten. When classification levels were gradually reduced decades later, few noticed. By the 1970s, the veterans who had first-hand experience were aging. By the time broader day classification occurred in the early 1990s, Many were gone, the opportunity to document. Footnote in an archival study. Occasional references buried in chemical warfare service histories, enough to reconstruct what happened, but not enough to make it common knowledge. This absence was not accidental. Post-war military doctrine favored clean categories: conventional, chemical, incendiary. If a weapon wins not by killing but by making survival impossible, how should it be judged? If it breaks resistance by removing air, heat tolerance, and visibility, where does responsibility lie? These questions had no easy answers, so they were avoided in public memory. The Pacific War became a story of courage, sacrifice, and overwhelming force. Bunker warfare was remembered as brutal or straightforward. The reality was more complex. Victory often came not from greater fiber, but from altering the environment in ways defenders could not endure. White phosphorus was one of the clearest examples of that truth, and it was quietly set aside, not destroyed, not disowned. The men who used it carried the memory forward privately. They understood that they had participated in something effective and deeply uncomfortable. They had seen how quickly certainty collapsed when the conditions of survival were removed. They had learned that wars are not always won by destroying the enemy. Sometimes they are won by making resistance impossible. That lesson remained embedded in doctrine long after the weapon itself disappeared from view, and it would resurface under different names and different forms whenever fortified positions once again proved immune to brute force. Although the weapon vanished from public discussion, the idea behind it did not. They absorbed them, refined them, and reintroduced them under different names. White phosphorus taught a lesson that planners would never forget. Fortifications are not defeated by destruction alone. They are defeated by removing the conditions that allow human beings to remain inside them. That principle survived long after the M10 round disappeared. In the decades following World War II, fortified warfare returned in different forms. Urban combat replaced island assaults. Concrete replaced volcanic rock. Caves became basements, tunnels, and reinforced structures. Embedded within cities, the problem remained the same. Enemies. Once again, brute force proved inefficient, and once again, militaries searched for ways to deny shelter rather than destroy it. New weapons emerged, designed not to level buildings but to make enclosed spaces uninhabitable. Thermobaric munitions, fuel-air explosives, enhanced smoke, and incendiary systems. Each used different mechanisms. Each carried different justifications. But all pursued the same effect: generate overwhelming heat, destroy visibility. Forced movement. The lineage was unmistakable. The lesson learned in the bunkers of Iwo Jima and the caves of Okinawa had not been forgotten. It had simply been rewritten. Modern doctrine speaks carefully about these weapons. It emphasizes legality, proportionality, and tactical necessity. But beneath the language lies the same understanding. An enemy willing to die cannot be coerced by fear of death. He can only be coerced by the impossibility of staying alive where he stands. This realization reshaped how militaries think about resistance. Endurance-based defense relies on predictability, on the belief that suffering can be endured. There are conditions the human body cannot endure, regardless of discipline: eye deprivation, extreme heat, loss of sensory perception. These are biological limits, not moral ones. What made the M10 round so effective was not its novelty. It was its alignment with those limits. For the men who used it, the experience was clarifying. They saw how quickly conviction collapsed when survival itself became uncertain. They saw how doctrine dissolved under physical reality. Many veterans later struggled to reconcile that knowledge. They had not won through superior courage or pride. They had won by changing the environment in ways no one could tolerate. How others avoided the subject entirely. The silence surrounding white phosphorus was not simply imposed from above, it was shared. Men understood that some victories come with truths that do not fit easily into public memory. As modern conflicts unfolded, echoes of the Pacific War appeared again and again. Urban sieges, Once more, militaries confronted the same dilemma. How do you dislodge an enemy who cannot be bombed out and will not surrender? The answers were never labeled as descendants of white phosphorus. They did not need to be. The principle was already internalized. What matters is not destruction. What matters is control of the environment. To deny air, to deny the physical possibility of resistance. White phosphorus was not the last weapon to embody that idea. It was simply one of the first to demonstrate it so clearly. Today, its story remains largely absent from mainstream histories, not because it lacks significance, but because it complicates the narrative. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about warfare, that wars are often decided not by who fights harder, but by who better understands the limits of human survival. The Marines who carried those rockets did not speak often about them. When they did, they rarely described the fire. They described the silence that followed. Pilots that had killed their friends went quiet. Advance resumed men went home who otherwise would not have. That was the legacy they carried. Not pride, not regret. Understanding that some weapons do not end battles by destruction, but by making resistance impossible. And that lesson, once learned, never truly disappears. Long after the smoke cleared, the weapon left little behind that could be photographed. There were no shattered buildings to point to, no collapsed fortresses that marked its success. Most of the bunkers and caves still stood. What changed was silence. Positions that had once poured fire across open ground no longer answered when approached. Tunnel entrances that had swallowed entire squads went dark. The ground itself felt different, not safer, but quieter. For the Marines who advanced afterward, the absence of resistance was unsettling. They had prepared themselves for death. They had prepared to fight men who would not retreat. Instead, they found abandoned weapons, discarded equipment, and spaces that no one could stay in for long. The men who carried the white phosphorus rounds rarely spoke about the experience afterward, not because they were ordered not to, but because they did not know how to explain what they had seen. They had watched defenders trained to die, choose to run. They had seen discipline collapse in seconds. They had learned that survival instincts could overpower even the strongest conditioning. That knowledge did not feel like victory. It felt like a boundary had been crossed. After the war, those men returned home. They found work. They raised families. They attended reunions. When they spoke about the Pacific, they talked about friends, about heat, about exhaustion. They did not talk about white fire. The records followed the same pattern. Official histories summarized the fighting in careful language. Bunker, reduction, hard-won advances, heavy resistance. The mechanism behind the change remained buried, not erased, just unspoken. Over time, new wars replaced old ones, new weapons entered arsenals, new doctrines filled manuals. But the lesson learned in those volcanic dug in deep enough to survive bombardment, whenever endurance replaced mobility. Again and again, militaries returned to the same solution, not to destroy fortifications, but to deny the conditions that made them survivable. White phosphorus was one expression of that idea, not the first, not the last, but one of the clearest. The men who experienced it understood something that rarely appears in textbooks. Wars are not decided solely by courage or fury. They are decided by limits of air, limits of heat, limits of what the human body can tolerate before doctrine stops mattering. The Japanese defenders who survived later described the weapon in simple terms. They did not speak about strategy. They spoke about the need to breathe. They spoke about fire that could not be escaped, smoke that filled everything, and the moment they realized staying meant dying without meaning. That moment changed the battle for the Marines. The weapon offered something rare in the Pacific wartime. Time to advance without sacrificing another squad. Time to survive an assault that would have killed them days earlier. That is why the weapon was used and why it was never celebrated. Its effectiveness carried a weight that did not fade with the war. White phosphorus did not win the Pacific War. It did not end the fighting. But in the final months, it revealed a truth that many preferred to forget, that victory sometimes comes not from destroying the enemy, but from removing the possibility of resistance. and that knowledge once gained cannot be undone. The Japanese called it White Death. The Marines who fired it called it something else. They called it the reason they made it home. And then, for decades, they chose not to speak about it again.